The year was 1888, and the silence of Redemption Gulch was a sickness. It lay thick over the cracked earth, clung to the leaning shoulders of the clapboard buildings, and settled deep in the bones of the men who stared out from beneath the brims of their hats with the same defeated eyes. Dust was the town's only currency, paid out by the merciless wind that scoured the plains, leaving everything coated in a fine red grit of failure. Into this crucible of despair rode Elias Blackwood, a man who wore grief like a second skin. His ranch, miles from this pocket of human misery, was his fortress, a kingdom of solitude built to honor the ghosts of a wife and child the earth had claimed 5 years prior. He came to town only when necessity demanded it, his face a mask of stone, his eyes fixed on the list of supplies clutched in his hand. He had no time for the town's cruel entertainments. But today, the silence was broken by the grating voice of a town magistrate turned auctioneer, and Elias found his path blocked by a crowd gathered in the main square. On a crude wooden platform stood the reason for the gathering, the woman. He could not see her face, for her head was covered by a coarse burlap sack, a final, brutal stamp of humiliation. A pauper's auction, they called it. A way for the town to settle the debts of the unfortunate by selling their labor, and in this case, their dignity, to the highest bidder. The shape beneath the worn dress was slender, her posture unnaturally straight, a lonely pillar of defiance in a sea of scorn. Elias felt an old, unwelcome stirring in his chest, a low thrum of anger that had long been muted by sorrow. He wanted to turn away, to ride back to the quiet agony of his ranch, but his feet felt rooted to the dusty ground, his gaze fixed on the hooded figure who stood as a monument to the world's casual cruelty. He recognized the magistrate, a man whose piety was as thin as his smile, and knew this was less about justice and more about sport. The auctioneer, a man named Barlow with eyes like polished river stones, began his patter. His words were slick with mock pity, describing the woman as a destitute widow, a burden on the good people of Redemption Gulch. "What am I bid for the indenture of this poor soul?" he crowed, gesturing to the silent figure. "Strong back, I'm told. Quiet, too. Won't give a man no trouble." A few grimy men chuckled, their bids coming in low and insulting. $1, offered by a prospector with more dote than coin to his name. $1.50, from a saloon owner known for his rough hands and fleeting temper. The bids were mockeries, each one another stone cast at the woman on the platform. Elias watched, his jaw tight. The sack over her head was an obscenity, an effort to strip away her humanity until she was nothing more than an object, a piece of chattel. Yet, he saw what the others did not, or chose to ignore. He saw the subtle tension in her bound hands, the unwavering stillness of her spine. There was a person inside that sack, a life fractured and put on display for the amusement of hollow men. He thought of his Sarah, of her kindness, of the gentle way she had moved through the world. An impotent rage, cold and sharp, called in his gut. This was a desecration of memory, of womanhood, of the simple decency he had once believed in. The bidding stalled at $3. Barlow was about to bring his gavel down, selling her to the leering saloon owner. The finality of it, the stomach-turning injustice, was more than Elias could bear. He had built a life around silence, but his own silence now felt like a betrayal. He took a step forward, the crowd parting slightly before his grim presence. His voice, when it came, was rough, torn from a place of disuse. $10. The words fell into the square like stones into a still pond, the ripples silencing the whispers and the jeers. A sum so absurdly high for such a transaction that it was an indictment of them all. Barlow's jaw snapped shut. The saloon owner scowled. Every eye in Redemption Gulch turned to the grieving rancher, the man who spoke to no one, who had just paid a king's ransom for a woman in a sack. The gavel fell with a sharp, definitive crack. The indenture was his. Elias moved toward the platform, his boots heavy in the dust. He ignored Barlow's outstretched hand, his gaze fixed on the woman. He mounted the 2 short steps, the wood groaning under his weight. He stood before her, the rough burlap of the sack only inches from his face. He could hear her breathing, a faint, shallow sound. He reached not for the sack, but for the coarse rope binding her wrists. With his pocket knife, he sawed through the fibers, his movements economical and precise. The rope fell away. Her hands, pale and trembling slightly, remained clasped in front of her. He stepped back, giving her space, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "Come." It was not a command so much as a statement of fact. She hesitated for only a second, then gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. She followed him down from the platform, her bare feet making no sound on the dusty earth. A path cleared for them as they walked toward his wagon, the townsfolk staring with a mixture of awe and confusion. He helped her onto the wagon seat, his touch on her elbow brief and impersonal. He untied his horse, climbed up beside her, and flicked the reins. The wagon lurched forward, leaving the stunned silence of Redemption Gulch behind them. The journey to his ranch was a study in quiet. The sun beat down, the wheels crunched over stone and sand, and the vast, empty sky stretched out above them. Elias did not speak. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the horizon, his hands firm on the reins, his mind a maelstrom. What had he done? He had sought solitude to nurse his wounds, and now he had brought a stranger into its heart. He was acutely, uncomfortably aware of her beside him. Of the space she occupied. And of the sack. It was a silent, screaming testament to her shame and his impulsiveness. From her perspective, hidden in the suffocating darkness, the world was a collection of muffled sounds and jarring movements. The man beside her was a void, a presence defined by a heavy, profound silence. It was not the cruel, mocking silence of the crowd, but something deeper, something ancient and sorrowful. It was a silence that felt, strangely, like a shield. In the pocket of her worn dress, her fingers curled around a small, smooth stone, a memento from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. It was her only anchor in this terrifying new reality. The ranch appeared on the horizon like a scar on the land, stark and lonely. The fences sagged with tired shoulders, the barn door hung on a single hinge, and the small house stood grey and weathered against the unforgiving sky. It was a place where life had been put on hold, frozen in a moment of unbearable loss. Elias brought the wagon to a halt near the porch. He climbed down and turned to help her, his hands hovering uncertainly before she slid down on her own, landing softly on the ground. She stood there, a strange, hooded figure against the backdrop of his desolate world. He led her into the house. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and disuse. A layer of grime covered every surface. Dishes were piled in a basin. A man's coat was slung over a chair. It was the home of someone who had ceased to care. He showed her to a small room at the back of the house. It contained a narrow cot with a thin blanket, a small crate for a table, and a wash basin. It was Spartan, but it was clean, and it had a door. He set a bucket of fresh water and a bar of lye soap on the crate. "The well is out back," he said, his words clipped. "The work is hard. You earn your keep." He did not mention the sack. He did not ask her name. He simply stated the terms of their new arrangement, a contract of labor, not of curiosity. Then he turned and left, closing the door softly behind him, granting her the one thing she had been denied all day, privacy. The silence that fell in his wake was profound. He stood in his own kitchen, listening to the quiet hum of the empty house, and felt the immense weight of the life he had just brought into his own. He had acted on an impulse of honor, and now he had to live with the consequences. He did not know who she was, what she looked like, or what sorrow she carried beneath that terrible hood. He only knew that she was here now, a living, breathing presence in the hollow chambers of his grief. Alone in the small, spare room, Ilara stood perfectly still for a long time, listening to the sound of his footsteps receding. The house was quiet, the silence broken only by the mournful sigh of the wind outside. Slowly, her trembling hands reached up. The rough texture of the burlap was coarse against her fingertips. With a deep, shuddering breath, she lifted the sack from her head. The sudden rush of light and air was a physical blow. She blinked, her eyes adjusting to the dim interior of the room. She dropped the sack to the floor as if it were a venomous snake and stumbled toward the wash basin. Looking at her reflection in the murky water, she saw a stranger. Her face was pale and smudged with dirt, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and exhaustion. There was no hideous scar, no disfigurement that would warrant such a cruel covering. There was only the profound weariness of a woman who had lost everything. She plunged her hands into the cool water and scrubbed at her face, washing away the grime and the shame of the auction block. The next morning, she emerged from her room as the sun was casting long, cool shadows across the yard. Elias was already at the woodpile, the rhythmic thud of his axe the only sound. He stopped mid-swing when he saw her. He looked at her face, really looked, for the first time. He saw the fine lines of hardship around her eyes, the quiet strength in the set of her jaw. He saw a sorrow that mirrored his own. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement, then turned back to his work. His lack of reaction was the greatest kindness he could have shown her. He asked no questions, offered no comment. He simply accepted her presence. And so their silent routine began. He wrestled with the land from sunup to sundown, mending the fences, tending the few cattle that remained, his movements fueled by a relentless, punishing energy. She, in turn, took on the house. With quiet efficiency, she scrubbed away the years of neglect. She washed the dishes, mended his torn shirts, and coaxed a warm, savory stew from the meager supplies in the pantry. Slowly, imperceptibly, the house began to feel less like a tomb and more like a home. It began to breathe again. He would watch her from a distance as he worked, her small figure moving with a purpose that had long been absent from his own life. He saw her one afternoon on her knees by a barren patch of earth near the porch, patiently pulling weeds, her hands working the dry, compacted soil. It was a small, almost hopeless gesture, but in it, he saw the first stirrings of a life refusing to be buried. Weeks bled into one another, measured not by conversation but by the shared rhythms of work and exhaustion. The silence between them remained, but its character had changed. It was no longer a tense, empty void, but a shared space, a quiet understanding that required no words. One afternoon, the sky turned a bruised, violent purple. The wind picked up, howling through the gaps in the barn walls. A storm was coming, one of the brutal, sudden squalls that could tear a ranch apart. Elias worked with a desperate urgency, trying to secure a section of fence that had finally given way, threatening to let his small herd scatter across the plains. Rain began to fall, first in fat, splattering drops, then in a torrential, blinding sheet. He was soaked to the bone, his hands numb with cold as he struggled to nail a loose board back into place. Through the deluge, he saw a light bobbing toward him. It was Elara, holding a lantern high, her thin dress plastered to her frame, her hair streaming water. She said nothing. She didn't need to. She simply came and stood near him, positioning the lantern so its golden light cut through the gloom, illuminating his work. He drove a nail home, his hammer striking true. He moved to brace a post, and she was there, her small, strong hands gripping the wood, holding it steady against the force of the wind while he worked. They were a team, moving in a silent, intuitive dance against the storm's fury. When the fence was finally secure, they trudged back to the house, leaving the groaning wind and rain behind them. Inside, the warmth of the stove was a balm. Elara put a pot of coffee on to boil while Elias shed his wet coat. She brought 2 steaming mugs to the table and they sat opposite each other, the silence broken only by the hiss of the storm outside and the sound of them sipping the hot, bitter liquid. For the first time, they were not just 2 separate people occupying the same space, but 2 people who had weathered something together. He looked at her hands wrapped around the mug. They were chapped and calloused from her work, yet they seemed possessed of a gentle strength. A tiny crack appeared in the wall of ice around his heart. He cleared his throat, the sound loud in the quiet room. "Thanks," he rasped. It was a single word, but it held the weight of 100 conversations. She met his gaze and gave a small, solemn nod. The garden she had started by the porch was no longer a barren patch of dirt. Tiny green shoots, fragile but determined, had pushed their way through the soil. It was a testament to her patience, a small flag of life planted in his desolate world. The ranch itself was slowly mending, the fences standing straighter, the barn door swinging on 2 hinges now. Her quiet, steady presence had brought an order not just to his house, but to the edges of his life. One evening, after a meager supper eaten in their usual companionable silence, Elias retreated to the small room he used as a study. It was the heart of his grief, the one place her influence had not yet reached. He sat at his dusty desk and opened a small wooden box. Inside, nestled on a piece of worn velvet, lay a small, intricately carved wooden bird. His hands, usually so steady and capable, trembled as he picked it up. The smooth wood was familiar, a painful memory made tangible. He had carved it for his daughter, Anna, the winter before the fever came. He was so lost in the past that he didn't hear Elara enter. She placed a cup of tea on the corner of his desk, her movements as quiet as a moth's wing. Her eyes fell on the bird in his hands. He saw not pity in her gaze, but a deep, knowing sorrow, an empathy that asked for nothing. The words were a physical weight in his chest, a pressure that had been building for 5 years. They came out broken, rusted from disuse. "It was my daughter's," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. Anna, the name hung in the air between them, a ghost summoned. There was a fever. It took her, and her mother. 5 years ago he did not look at her as he spoke, his eyes fixed on the wooden bird, on the ghost of a small hand that had once held it. He expected her to offer empty condolences, the meaningless phrases people used when faced with a grief too large to comprehend. Instead, she was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft, yet steady. "My husband was David," she said. "He was a good man. A miner." There was a collapse. 2 years ago, it was an offering, a sharing of wounds. She laid her own tragedy down beside his, not to compare, but to connect. In that small, dusty room, surrounded by ghosts, 2 lonely souls finally spoke the same language, the language of loss. The fragile peace they had built was shattered by the arrival of a horse and rider. It was Barlow, the town magistrate, his self-satisfied smirk firmly in place. He dismounted without being invited, his polished boots leaving arrogant prints in the yard Elara had so carefully swept. Elias met him on the porch, his body a silent barrier between the man and his home. "Blackwood," Barlow said, foregoing any pleasantry. "I'm here on official business." There appears to have been an error in the paperwork regarding the woman's indenture. Elias's face was unreadable, a mask of granite. "There was no error," Barlow chuckled, a condescending sound. "A technicality. The debt wasn't properly filed. Her indenture is void. The town council has ordered her returned." His eyes flickered past Elias toward the open doorway, a greedy light in their depths. It was a lie, and they both knew it. This was a power play, a cruel attempt to reclaim the woman he saw as his property. Elias did not move. The stoic grief that had defined him for years was now forged into something else, a cold, unshakable resolve. He was no longer just a man hiding from the world, he was a man protecting his world. "She is not for sale," he said, his voice dangerously low. The indenture was a legal transaction. "I have the bill of sale, a piece of paper," Barlow sneered. "I represent the law in this county." The standoff was thick with unspoken violence. Barlow, used to wielding his petty authority over the desperate, found himself unnerved by the absolute stillness of the man before him. There was no fear in Elias's eyes, only a promise of consequence. After a long, tense moment, the magistrate seemed to shrink. He backed away, sputtering threats about sheriffs and judges, before hauling himself onto his horse and riding away in a cloud of indignant dust. Elias stood watching until he was gone, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He turned. Elara was standing in the doorway, her face pale, her hands gripping the doorframe. He saw the terror in her eyes, the fear of being cast out again, of having the small, fragile sanctuary she had found ripped away. In that instant, he understood. This was no longer about a $10 bid or an act of honor. It wasn't about an indenture. It was about her. It was about the woman who had planted a garden in the wasteland of his heart. The walk from the edge of the porch to the doorway felt like crossing a vast canyon. He stopped in front of her, the air crackling with everything they had never said. He looked at her, at the quiet dignity that had survived the auction block, at the resilience that had brought his home back to life. The words were direct, stripped of all artifice, as was his way. "The indenture is paid," he said, his voice steady. "You are free to go." He let the words hang there, giving her the freedom he had purchased. He took a breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. "But I am asking you to stay." He paused, the silence stretching, holding the entire weight of their shared past and uncertain future. "Will you be my wife?" Ilara stared at him, her mind struggling to comprehend the question. It was not a proposition of convenience, not an extension of her servitude. She saw it in his eyes, in the raw vulnerability that had broken through his stoic facade. It was an offer. An offer of partnership, of permanence. Of a home. Tears welled, blurring his image. They were not tears of sorrow or fear, but of a profound, soul-shaking release. A dam of unshed grief and loneliness broke inside her, washing away the last remnants of the shame from the auction block. Her gaze moved past him, to the mended fence in the distance, to the small, thriving garden by the porch, to the quiet order she had brought to this house. It was her work, her life. She had, without realizing it, already put down roots in this hard, unforgiving soil. She had built a place for herself beside this quiet, wounded man who had shielded her with his silence and defended her with his strength. He had paid $10 for her indenture, but he had given her back her humanity, piece by piece, without ever demanding a thing. Her voice, when it came, was not a loud, joyous cry, but a sound as quiet and certain as the green shoots in her garden. "Yes," she whispered. The word was a key, unlocking the tension that had held them both captive. A smile touched Elias's lips. It was a small, hesitant thing, unfamiliar and rusty, but it transformed his face, chasing away the shadows and revealing the man he had been before sorrow claimed him. It was the first time she had seen him truly smile, and it was beautiful. He lifted his hand, not to take or to command, but with his palm open in a gesture of offering. After a moment's hesitation, she placed her hand in his. His skin was rough and calloused against her own, a testament to his life of hard labor. His grip was firm, yet gentle. It was a silent vow, a contract of the heart, far more binding than any piece of paper signed in a dusty town square. They stood there for a long moment in the doorway of the house, two solitudes merging into a shared future. Their wedding was as quiet as their courtship. A silver-haired reverend from a neighboring county, a man with kind eyes and a gentle voice, performed the simple ceremony on the porch of the ranch house. There were no guests, no fanfare. Their only witnesses were the vast, silent plains and the wide-open sky. It was a union forged not in ceremony, but in the crucible of shared hardship and unspoken understanding. Their life together unfolded in a series of quiet tableaus, a montage of healing. They worked as partners, a silent rhythm guiding their days. When they mended the barn roof, she was the one on the ground, passing him the nails, her upturned face a study in concentration. When they worked in the expanding garden, it was she who taught him the names of the vegetables and the few stubborn wildflowers that bloomed, her fingers gentle as she pointed out the difference between a weed and a promise. He listened, his silence now one of thoughtful attention, not sorrowful distance. The house, once a tomb of grief, was now filled with the small, comforting sounds of a shared existence, the scrape of a chair, the clink of a spoon against a bowl, the soft murmur of their sparse but meaningful conversations in the evenings. The oppressive quiet had been replaced by a deep and abiding peace. He started carving again, his hands rediscovering their old skill. He no longer carved only birds of sorrowful memory, but horses, strong and free, and small, sturdy farm animals. He was carving a new life, a new history for them both. One evening, as twilight bled purple and gold across the horizon, they sat on the porch steps, a comfortable space between them. The air was cool and smelled of dust and blooming night flowers. He had been working on a new piece of wood all afternoon. He finished the last cut, blew away the shavings, and held it out to her. It was a small, perfectly formed horse, its head high, its wooden muscles tensed as if ready to run toward the future. She took it from him, her fingers tracing the smooth, loving lines he had carved into the wood. She held it in both hands, a symbol of their journey, a testament to the home they had built not from wood and stone, but from the salvaged pieces of their broken hearts. They did not need to touch. The space between them was no longer an empty chasm, but a bridge built of resilience, respect, and a quiet, unshakable love. In the fading light, they watched the first stars appear, two survivors who had found in each other's company not a cure for their old wounds, but a way to finally, peacefully, live with the scars.